governments are a recent invention, but human society has been organized into groups from prehistorical times. For example, in Europe, there were these hunter-gatherer societies, that lived in small groups, and they had their own social norms of what to do and what not to do. And there was no government. So they had to play the game by a certain set of rules. And social norms provided those rules.
Right.
But there'd obviously be people who'd like to game the system, so to speak, and try to break those rules. And then if they were to break the rules, then they would be observed breaking the rules by the social group at some point in time, and then they'd probably face sanctions. And the worst sanction used to be ostracized from the social group. And this would bring great shame and dishonor to the family and to that particular individual, who'd almost surely die in the snow in hunter-gatherer societies if they were ostracized from the group, because you can only cooperatively hunt and stay together. So these insights we know from anthropology and sociology. So because human evolution traversed the kind of paths that I'm talking about, shame aversion became a pretty ingrained part of the human psyche. Guilt is a more modern you could have guilt with respect to internal moral norms. We all have internal moral norms. We have a moral compass of what we should do, what we shouldn't do. Sometimes we break our own internal moral norms, and then we might feel guilty with respect to that. But capitalism is organized around industrial production. Firms and workers, and the employment relationship is very important. And it's partly been disciplined by feeling guilty from letting down the expectations of the firm. So there has been this conflict between guilt and shame. And as industrial revolution happened and as societies continued to develop, the traditional bonds and traditional networks, they started falling apart. People felt less and less worried in terms of whether they would be sanctioned for violating social norms. And we live in very impersonal surroundings now, and so shame probably plays a lower role. So in California, for example, they found that guilt was more important than shame. But in traditional, say, Pakistani microfinance borrowers that I was talking about, the opposite was true, because they live in these closely knit village societies where shame is the predominantly important emotion. And when there's a conflict between shame and guilt, it gets resolved in favor of shame. Because evolutionarily speaking, they're living in very similar setups to what they were living. And interestingly, I didn't get a chance to talk about the team contracts experiments. Again, those experiments were done at the Center for Social and Behavioral Change under Pawan's very excellent team. I think Ayush led a lot of those experiments. And we also did those experiments in the United Kingdom with university students. So we put them in situations where guilt and shame both played out, and they had to make choices for one or the other. The Indian students behaved exactly like UK students. So those students were from Ashoka University and from urban Indian universities, and that's what globalization has done. It's made people more responsive to guilt aversion rather than shame aversion. These are the changing times. But for researchers like me, it's really important to study the relative interplay of those two emotions, because then, for example, they could have different policy implications for policymakers. Should I really be designing an intervention that taps into someone's guilt aversion or someone's shame aversion? And for the same intervention, for someone in traditional societies, the government might wish to tap into their shame aversion. But for the urban areas, they might be wanting a slightly different intervention that taps into someone's guilt aversion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my answer.